Okay, wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Warsaw and the 2022 Global Forum on Nicotine. It's really great to have so many people in the room here after, since 2019. We've run hybrid events and so on, but it's not the same as people being in the room. That said, the technology has allowed friends and colleagues from all over the world to zoom in, be part of the whole event, see and hear the key presentations, join in the Q&As, watch the GFN'22s. So welcome to you all. This is the first of 7 commentary team sessions. I'm Harry Shapiro from KAC, and I've got with me Nancy Lucas, a passionate and compassionate tobacco harm reduction activist, founder and executive coordinator of the Coalition of Asia Pacific Tobacco Harm Reduction Advocates. And next to her is Dr. Carl Fagerström, a clinical psychologist from Sweden, founding member of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, a legend, I have to say, a legend in clinical research on tobacco and nicotine with over 100 peer-reviewed papers to his credit. So welcome to you both.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
The theme of this year's conference is Here for Good. Leaving snus aside for the moment, which we will come back to.
We won't forget
but
you.
In 2006, I suspect you could easily have accommodated all the world's vapors in this hotel with room to spare.
Possibly.
And now there are over 100 million people worldwide using vaping products, heated tobacco products, and Swedish-style snus oral products. So just coming to Nancy first, I mean, does it kind of feel that way to you? How far along the road do you think we've come? Does it really feel now that we're here for good?
Yes, it does. It does feel that we're here for good, and a lot of it, for me, has to do with the things that are happening in the Asia-Pacific region.
Right.
You know, pre-COVID, I never would have imagined that we'd be sitting here with the Philippines pending, Malaysia going legal on the 3rd of August, and the possibility of Thailand actually going to have regulations.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
That would have been the farthest thing from my mind. I do believe it's here for good. The advocates are very passionate about what they're doing, and we're all, one of the benefits of COVID, I have to bring this up, one of the benefits of COVID is because we couldn't get together, because, you know, advocacy can be a very lonely thing to do. The internet and all of these programs have helped us to actually not only get together once a year, but more often, and collaborate and engage with each other. And I think that is one of the blessings of COVID, and I think that is also helping to make sure that, yes, tobacco harm reduction is here for good.
Right. It's interesting that you should mention some of the legislative stuff that's happening, like you say, particularly in Thailand, because everyone's got this idea of the kind of monolithic WHO, FCTC. Everybody does what the FCT Secretariat says. So, from your perspective, and it's remarkable, really, that those what's happening? How has it come about, do you think? Why are these sort of chinks in the armor, shall I say?
I think, and it's a sad reality, I think the WHO and these experts have lost a lot of their shine by the way they handled COVID.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's helping us in a very strange kind of way. It is helping us, and mind you, we'll take it. Absolutely, we'll take it.
Right.
It's brought people together, and like I said, COVID has brought people together, and governments, you know, were relying on the advice of these experts to deal with this pandemic, and it was completely mishandled.
Right. That's really interesting, because it's a theme we're going to come back to in this conversation, hopefully. This whole business of the degree to which trust in medical and public health agents has been eroded by what's been happening. And just as a sort of follow-up then, There was a first session yesterday involving consumer groups around preparations for COP10.
Yeah.
Now, we know that the last COP was online, not much really happened, and they tabled stuff about tobacco harm reduction and safer nicotine products for COP10. Yeah. And the message, somebody's doing the whole kind of siren stuff here, so we'll move on.
Sorry, people.
That the message that came out of COP9 apparently from one of the delegates in the meeting yesterday was that there's a feeling now within the COP that they have to somehow address this tobacco harm reduction debate. Yeah. Now, I kind of shudder to think how they're actually going to do that.
What does that mean?
What does that actually mean? Yeah. But the message that came out was really, even more than ever, don't wait until next year, from an advocate's point of view, to start contacting your local, your national MPs and all the rest, and your health minister. You really need to start getting your act together now, because COP10 could be more important than all the other COPs on this issue. Yeah. So what about CAFRA in all of this?
Well, the way we do things is, and with the last one, we started preparing for the next one after the last one finished.
Right, okay.
A lot of that has to do with the fact that where we are getting information is like pulling, hen's teeth, right? And it's also, the way they're very, they're not very open about what they're going to discuss or what they're going to do. So what we have to do is we go to our regional offices and we're constantly reviewing and analyzing if there's anything new coming out. Is there something happening, in another region that's going to affect us? We start that immediately after the last COP.
Right.
Because then it gives you somewhat of a feel of what they're going to possibly do. You never know exactly what they're going to do. No. But you do know that 6 months, 9 months before the actual meeting, they've already set up that agenda. So you have to kind of stay on top of it.
Right, right. And do you feel that what's been happening in your recent that we've just discussed about Thailand, Malaysia, must be helpful? It must be helpful for what's coming up, do you think?
Yes, I believe so. But, a lot of this, it's not just because, they're accepting tobacco harm reduction. A lot of these countries have lost a lot of money and revenue because of the economic shutdown. Right. A lot of these countries are also realizing, hey, wait a minute, we can put excise on this, regulate the market, and they're making money because they're lost money. So there's many different variables as to why this is happening.
Right.
We'll take it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll take it.
If I can come to Carl now. We've got upcoming sessions on the really appalling treatment of academics, clinicians in recent years. People who've been banned from coming to conferences, like this one, for instance, having speaking engagements cancelled, rumours and smears spread about them, articles, perfectly robust methodological articles, rejected by journals on the basis of, you work for the tobacco industry, or you got some money from the tobacco industry. I heard in one case somebody had a paper rejected going back to the 1990s, when they had some funding. And I know you've had some experience of this as well. Would you just briefly give us an idea of how all of this has affected you in the past?
Yes.
Or maybe not so much in the past.
First, let me say that during my training at the university, it was very important when you was a scientist to be neutral and objective and close to the data, and not let prejudices and opinions entering how you interpreted the data. So then you get into a reality where that is absolutely not the case in most circumstances. I, for example, have seen this myself and have been receiving harsh treatments. I was a long-standing member in the European Respiratory Society, which is the group for European lung physicians, actually, and was banned from membership because I was speaking too stubbornly about harm reduction and openly. I was also elected the chair of the SRNT, Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco in the US, And when I was about to take the chair, there was rumors that I had been speaking to Swedish Match and was favorable for companies' tobacco products, so I had to resign. And there has been other examples, of course, when papers have been rejected, because not that I have been employed or taking salary or even consulted, but being close to, being in their circles, agreeing to what they are saying. And this is problematic for academics, particularly if they are not about to retire, because they have their life on stake here, the money for the and the food for the table. So they have to kind of obey to normal circumstances, putting food on the table. And there are money available, for example, the Tobacco-Free Foundation's money, which very, very few can take, although you think there are very close borders from the tobacco industry that actually gave the money from the very beginning to influence anything. So, yeah, in essence, why it is so difficult for many to stand up and speak up is simply that there is no social capital for it, there is no scientific capital to win, there is no political capital to win. It's almost always a loss unless you are in a group where there is support. And that, I think, is also important, that we have conferences like this where people active in the area can go and be recognized and meet others and feel a bit of a security in the area they are working in.
I mean, I did look at your kind of biography before we started, and noted that back in 1999, you were given a WHO award for your kind of contributions to tobacco science and tobacco control. Yet here we are in 2022, where the WHO invokes Article 5.3, interpreted beyond all reasonableness. Does it feel like the WHO has kind of lost its way? That back in 1999, there were, again, snooze to one side, of course, because people weren't really thinking about tobacco harm reduction in 1999. Life was more straightforward. There was evil tobacco companies over here. There were the good guys and the good girls over here doing their the doctors and the clinicians and the public health campaigners and all the rest of it. Now, of course, it's very much a grey area, and I'm just wondering if you kind of feel from a more kind of wider perspective, what's going on here? What is this objection to harm reduction that's caused all the things that you've just been talking about?
I think many, and particularly in the quarters of WHO, they come from an opinion that nicotine is a drug and nicotine is not essential for life. We don't need it, so therefore we have to go against it. Harm reduction would make it simply more difficult and at least take longer for us to get rid of nicotine. So they have a very idealistic view of what life is here on Earth. Paradise hasn't occurred here, at least not where I see it. And all cultures are using some form of drug, call it cultural drugs if you like. And tobacco, alcohol, and caffeine has been the most common ones. What we see in countries, and particularly in the United States, with the legalization of marijuana and cannabis, that is that the use of that goes up and the use of smoking goes down. It's a little bit like communicating jar. So you probably can get rid or at least control one drug more effectively if you introduce another one. But is that really what we want? And if I would have to choose between smoking 15, 20 cigarettes a day and having 1 or 2 joints of marijuana a day, it may not be a big difference in harm, although there is no psychotoxicity with nicotine, which it is with cannabis and THC particularly. But if we were to compare marijuana use with very low harm products like snus and the new non-tobacco nicotine pouches, would you still prefer to have people using cannabis? And I did a study in my country where I also looked at dependence to caffeine and alcohol, and there is actually in my country, probably in most other countries, more in absolute numbers heavily dependent consumers on caffeine than nicotine, simply because there is so many more using caffeine than nicotine.
So really what you're saying from this whole mess that we seem to have got into is much more ideological than it is to do with anything to do with public health, because we seem to be in a bizarre situation where you have international tobacco control establishment who are supposed to be tackling death and disease from smoking, campaigning against new ways of tackling death and disease from smoking. If I can come back to Nancy, we've got a session coming up on the abuse of philanthropic funds. Now, there are anti-tobacco harm reduction NGOs out there who are in receipt of millions of dollars to basically damage public health. By contrast, the tobacco harm reduction advocacy groups mostly exist on little or no money at all. They might be one-person outfits in a back bedroom with a laptop, and that's the advocacy group for that country. There must be a high rate of burnout. How do people cope? I mean, you mentioned COVID had a good side, but what advice can you kind of give for people out there? And I'm sure lots of them are zooming in at this very moment, zooming in. Just in terms of support and how they can feel less isolated.
Well, when I began as a consumer advocate, there wasn't, like you said, there weren't 100 million vapors in the world. And it was very isolating, and it was very intimidating, because you realize that, you have to speak to people that normally are in a position of authority. And some people are intimidated by it. And in some countries, that's culturally inappropriate.
Right.
Okay? You could get into a lot of trouble. Thailand, for example.
Okay.
Previous, you speak out against the king, you're winding up in jail. That's it, done, right? So for those people that are out there and they don't have a local support, there is a great big community out there. And that's how COVID helped us, is because we couldn't come here and meet at GFN. We use the technology to get together. And there is always somebody out there that is willing to help you. One of the things about the advocacy community in the main is that we are a very big, happy, dysfunctional family, I guess is the best way of putting it. There are no barriers. It's very accepting. It's inclusive. So I would say to someone out there that is doing the advocacy on their own or wants to get involved in advocacy, if you're watching this, look, do they list our groups and things on the actual program or on the website? I think they do.
Yeah, I think
you can always contact this, the GFN people and say, hey, listen, I'm here, and forward it. Maybe it'll get forwarded to whoever you need to talk to. But you're not alone. I mean, the thing I would say to them is you are not alone. It just feels that way.
I mean, and I'm actually because my background is from the world of illegal and controlled drugs, NGOs in the UK. Spent a lot of years with a number of my colleagues at KAC as drug and HIV harm reduction advocates. And I was always struck that the beginnings of drugs and HIV harm reduction was very much like tobacco harm reduction, in the sense it's what I call guerrilla public health. It's like the people who began to distribute condoms in the United States were from the affected communities. The people who started to give out needles and syringes, despite all the medical and public health opposition to all of this, they were people from affected communities. And certainly in the early years of vaping, 2005, 6, and onwards, it just grew like topsy. And the internet was obviously a massive help in all of this.
Yes.
Because I think going back then, there were a lot of like smoke-free workplaces, for instance.
I remember when all that came in. Yes, I am that old.
So you had people outside in little huddles in the pouring rain,
or the snow,
trying to eat, trying to smoke a cigarette, and this whole vaping thing was like and so they were the sort of social pariahs. They were the people. Oh bloody hell, you're smokers. We don't have anything to do with you. You're horrible. Yeah. You're going to give us cancer. So the whole vaping thing, which is why it's so important to get people to switch, because there are lots of people who are currently smoking. Well, they say they want to give up, but a lot of them, I think, wish they wanted to give up, which is not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And there's a whole, support network out there. A lot of the vape shops, the guys and girls who work there are very supportive. But yeah, so the message out there, people, is there is, I can't remember the exact number. KAC is in the process of publishing a paper that's done a whole survey of advocacy groups around the world. But there are a lot of you out there. Almost, most countries of the world have got at least somebody that's kind of working in this. So please connect, and we can put you in touch. Going to go back to Carl now, and talk specifically about snus, which, as we said before, has been around for a lot longer than everything else. But since I suppose the late 90s, when you were writing papers and Lars Randström and other people were writing papers about the emerging, what by then was emerging clinical evidence that these were really much safer than smoking, and it was reflecting in the rise in snus against the falling in lung cancer and smoking rates amongst adults in Sweden. And I just kind of wondered, bearing in mind weather in Scandinavia, frost and ice and stuff, has snus come in from the cold, even in Sweden now?
Not really. You see, in the beginning of the 20th century, snus was more used than tobacco for smoking. Yeah? But then, as in most other countries, cigarettes were overtaking the market. But not completely. Snus was remaining among loggers, farmers, miners, where it was simply more practical than lighting a cigarette. And if you're a farmer, you may not, it's hazardous also.
Yeah.
And so in the 1970s, beginning of the 1970s, we had the students being very radical. They turned to all kind of behaviors that was making them associating with deep people fundamentally in the workers. So they saw the snus use, and they took up snus use. But also one thing which I think was very crucial was that it was a monopoly at that time, Swedish tobacco monopoly. They advertised that there are ways to enjoy tobacco without smoking. And that was at the time when passive smoking was becoming a problem. So I think that set very well with many smokers, that there are other ways to enjoy tobacco. And then little by little, and the epidemiology started to kick in, and many smokers, despite being uninformed about the true harms of snus, turned to snus. At least there was no smoke and harming others. And sometimes there were papers writing about a new scientific study coming out that very little associations were seen with harmful effects of smoking. So in short, I think that's a bit of a Swedish history.
So what do you think was the EU excuse for banning snus was that harmonisation of that, which actually doesn't make an awful lot of sense to most people.
No, I mean that something is wrong here is very easily shown by FDA, that approved Swedish snus as the first and so far only harm reduction product, while it's banned in the European Union. Someone is going to be wrong here.
Yeah.
And how can two big institutions with good scientists interpret the same data so differently? It's very strange.
Well, we've just had a tobacco strategy review paper published in the UK only a few days ago, looking towards smoke-free by 2030. I can't remember when it was. And there was a kind of bizarre take on snus. And it said something like, the strategy generally should be to promote products that don't contain tobacco. So that was sort of thumbs up for vaping and all the patches and gums and all of that. And not promoting or not so much allowing in terms of snus, products that contain tobacco, forgetting the fact that you can buy cigarettes wherever you like. And so therefore, because you've got all these alternative cessation products, they didn't see any validity in allowing snus in the UK, even though the UK no longer has to subscribe to the EU TPD. And then in the next paragraph, it was talking about heated tobacco products. And it was saying, we want more research. We want the companies to pay for the technology, and which they do anyway. And then so we can consider an appropriate regulatory framework for them. And I'm thinking, well, that's great. They don't want to start banning things. But hang on, heated tobacco products have got tobacco in them. Yeah. So it just seemed like a complete nonsense. And it seemed to me much more about politics than much that was going to do any good about public health. I'm not sure how much time I've got for this last question for Carl, but just most of what's been said about vaping, it causes kids to transition to smoking, causes death and disease with EVALI, and some of the most ridiculous things, depression, erectile dysfunction. I mean, the people who are anti-tobacco harm reduction have got pretty desperate now in terms of trying to find bad things about vaping. But there is still this issue of addiction. And that still causes, a healthy debate, even within the tobacco harm reduction scientific and academic community. The trouble with a word like addiction, of course, it conjures up all the worst images of the worst outcomes from heroin, from crack, from crystal meth, and all the rest of it. And it feels, to me anyway, and I'd be interested to see what you think, that really we're talking about a habit. We're not really, we don't talk about, in the same way that we would, you mentioned caffeine earlier on. And we do, like I say, even within this community, because it's almost the last thing that people can hit the community with. It's, okay, well, we'll accept all that other stuff is fine, and it's safer, and it's less toxic, all the rest of it, but it's still addictive. How do we respond to that kind of thing, do you think?
Yes, if we talk about coffee, which certainly is dependence producing, although it's not recognized as that by all countries' medical authorities. Coffee is dependence producing. Is that a problem? Are we dependent on screens in general? Are some dependent on games and certain games in general? Yes, dependence, I rather call it dependence, because I think addiction evokes some other associations which are not so helpful here. Of course, it's better to be without a dependent state if that is possible. But I mean, also alcohol. We have alcoholics, of course. They are clearly dependent. We know what an alcoholic is. We know what he can do. But dependence, there is a continuum from those who are absolutely not at all in any degree dependent on alcohol, and little by little. And many on this conference might also have a alcohol dependence without really knowing about it, talking about it. It doesn't trouble anyone. It's only when it gets to situations like with illicit drugs, which have clearly very psychotoxic effects, and I think that's the key here. Caffeine is not psychotoxic, nicotine is not psychotoxic, alcohol is, cocaine is, and most of the other drugs are. So I think if the drug itself doesn't get you drugged and drowsy and you lose performance, accuracy, etc., we can kind of accept it because it has positive effects in the society. It can act as a bit of a grease. I mean, that's what we say of alcohol, that's what we say with caffeine, and that also could be the case for nicotine. Some people may get by in their life treating their most often subclinical conditions with a bit of nicotine, but if they cannot have it, maybe they look for something else.
Right. Well, that's it. That's the end of our first commentary team. Thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you very much, Carl. But do stay tuned. We've got the Michael Russell oration. Michael Russell, as many of you will know, was a godfather of tobacco harm reduction and coined that phrase: "People smoke for the nicotine and die from the tar." And then we've got the Kevin Malloy Fellowship Award. Kevin was a much valued member of the KAC team, the inspiration really for the scholarship program, who we sadly lost last year. And so now there's going to be a fellowship award made to a recipient, the first recipient, after the oration. So please stay tuned, and please do enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.